There are two ways to walk into a building. One version of you walks in checking the time, counting down to the next break, waiting for permission to speak, waiting for someone else to decide what the day means. The other version of you walks in already owning the outcome, already carrying the weight of the mission, already thinking 3 moves ahead. Same building. Same desk. Same 4 walls. Completely different person. That is the first thing you have to understand before anything else in this book will make sense. Entrepreneurship is not a job title. It is not a company registration number or a business card. It is a mindset that you can carry into any room, any role, any circumstance, and it is a mindset that most people never develop, because nobody ever demanded it of them. The employee mindset is built on a simple, comfortable lie: someone else is responsible for the outcome. If the company fails, it was the CEO's fault. If the product doesn't sell, it was marketing's fault. If the year goes badly, it was the economy's fault. There is a strange peace in that kind of thinking, because it removes the weight of responsibility from your shoulders. But it also removes the power. You cannot fix what you refuse to own. The owner mindset flips that entirely. When you think like an owner, there is no one left to blame. The problem in front of you is your problem, whether or not your name is on the building. This is uncomfortable at first, because it means the buck stops with you even when you have no formal authority. But that discomfort is exactly where growth lives. The moment you stop waiting for permission to think like the person in charge is the moment you start becoming that person, regardless of your title. I want you to notice something about the people who eventually build wealth, build companies, build influence that outlasts them. Almost none of them waited until they had the title before they adopted the mindset. They thought like owners while they were still employees. They thought like CEOs while they were still interns. They practiced the identity long before the world handed them the paperwork to match it. The world does not hand out ownership. You take it, quietly, in the way you show up before anyone officially asks you to. This is not about arrogance. An owner mindset is not about acting like you run things you don't run, or overstepping boundaries that aren't yours to cross. It is about the internal posture you bring to your work. It is the difference between doing a task because you were told to and doing a task because you understand why it matters to the whole. It is the difference between fixing what's broken because it's in your job description and fixing what's broken because you cannot stand to watch something fail when you had the power to prevent it. Ask yourself honestly, when something goes wrong around you, is your first instinct to explain why it wasn't your fault, or to figure out what you can do about it? That single reflex tells you more about which mindset you're currently operating from than any personality test ever could. The good news is that reflex can be trained. Every single day gives you dozens of small opportunities to practice ownership instead of avoidance, a mistake you could quietly fix instead of ignore, a gap you could fill instead of step around, a decision you could make instead of escalate. Entrepreneurs are not a different species. They are people who got tired of waiting for someone else to solve the problem in front of them. Somewhere along the way, they stopped asking, "Whose job is this?" and started asking, "What needs to happen, and who is going to make it happen if not me?" That single question, repeated enough times, rewires a person. It turns spectators into builders. You do not need capital to start thinking this way. You do not need a business registration, a product, or a team. You need to start today, in whatever room you are currently standing in, treating the outcome as yours. Treating the mission as yours. Treating the standard as yours to protect, even when no one is watching and no one would ever know if you let it slide. This chapter is your foundation, because everything else in this book, the strategy, the risk-taking, the leadership, the money, will collapse without it. You cannot build a CEO's decisions on top of an employee's identity. The identity has to shift first. So before you close this chapter, make a decision. From this point forward, you are not waiting for a title to think like the person who owns the outcome. You already are that person. The paperwork will catch up. There is a practical way to start practicing this today, wherever you currently stand. At the end of each day, ask yourself one question: where did I act like an owner today, and where did I act like a spectator waiting to be told what to do? Be specific. Maybe you noticed a process at work that wastes time, and instead of quietly noting it, you proposed a fix. Maybe a client had an unusual request, and instead of saying, "That's not my department," you found out who could actually help and connected them yourself. These small moments feel insignificant in isolation, but they are the daily repetitions that build the muscle. No one builds an owner's instincts by reading about it once. They build it by choosing it, deliberately, in 100 small moments most people would let pass by unnoticed. Watch out, too, for the moments when the employee mindset tries to creep back in disguised as humility. Telling yourself, "It's not really my place to say anything," or "I don't want to overstep," can sound respectful, but it is often just fear wearing a polite mask. There is a real difference between overstepping someone's authority and simply caring enough to speak up, offer a solution, or take initiative within your own lane. Learn to tell the two apart. Owners speak up. Owners take initiative. Owners don't wait to be rescued from problems they are fully capable of solving themselves. None of this happens overnight, and you shouldn't expect it to. The shift from employee thinking to owner thinking is closer to physical training than a light switch. It's built through repeated reps, some of which will feel awkward or uncertain at first, especially if you've spent years in environments that rewarded waiting for instructions over taking initiative. Give yourself grace as you build this muscle, but don't give yourself permission to stop practicing. Every day you delay the shift is a day spent operating below the level you're actually capable of. The identity is available to you right now, in your current role, with your current title, starting with your very next decision. Vision before capital: why clarity beats money every time. Everyone wants to talk about money first. How much do you need to start? Who's going to fund it? What's the budget? These are valid questions, but they are the wrong questions to ask first, because money without a clear vision is just noise with a bank balance attached. I have watched people with significant capital burn through it in months because they never answered the one question that mattered: what, exactly, are you building, and why does it need to exist? Vision is not a slogan you put on a website. It is not a vague dream about financial freedom or being your own boss. Those are feelings, not visions. A real vision is specific enough that you could hand it to a stranger and they would understand exactly what problem you are solving, for whom, and why your solution deserves to exist in a crowded world. If your vision cannot survive that test, it is not ready to carry capital yet, because capital poured into a fuzzy idea just accelerates the confusion. Here is what most people get backwards: they believe that once they have enough money, the vision will sharpen itself. It rarely works that way. Money tends to amplify whatever is already there. If there is clarity underneath it, money accelerates the clarity into results. If there is confusion underneath it, money accelerates the confusion into losses. This is why some entrepreneurs turn a small amount of capital into an empire, while others turn a large amount of capital into nothing. The difference was never really about the size of the check. So before you chase funding, chase clarity. Sit with hard questions until you can answer them without flinching. Who is this for? What do they currently do without your solution, and why is that current option not good enough? What happens in the world if you never build this? Does anyone actually notice, or does life go on exactly the same? If the honest answer is that nothing changes without you, you don't yet have a vision worth funding. You have a hobby. Clarity also does something capital cannot buy you: it filters your decisions. When you know exactly what you're building and why, you can say no quickly to distractions, side opportunities, and shiny objects that would otherwise drain your time and money. Without that clarity, every new idea looks equally appealing, and you end up scattered across 5 half-finished projects instead of one that actually works. A sharp vision acts like a filter that money can never replace. It tells you what to ignore. There's a discipline in this that most people avoid because it's uncomfortable: writing the vision down in plain language and testing it against reality before you spend a single naira or dollar chasing it. Talk to the people you claim to be solving a problem for. Ask if the problem is real to them, and ask what they currently do about it. If they shrug, if they seem unbothered, if the problem you thought was urgent turns out to be minor in their daily life, that is information you need before you build, not after you've spent your savings. I've seen founders fall in love with their own idea so completely that they stopped listening to the market's answer. That is the danger of vision without humility. It becomes a fantasy you protect instead of a hypothesis you test. The strongest visions are held firmly enough to guide decisions, but loosely enough to be refined by real feedback. You are not married to your first draft of the idea. You are married to the underlying problem you're trying to solve. Once the vision is clear, capital becomes a tool instead of a crutch. You stop asking, how much money do I need to feel ready, and start asking, what is the smallest, smartest use of resources that proves this vision works? That question alone will save you from the trap so many entrepreneurs fall into, spending big before they've proven small. Prove the vision on a shoestring first. Let the results, not your hope, tell you when it's time to scale the money behind it. Vision before capital is not a rejection of money. It is respect for it. Money is expensive fuel, and you don't pour expensive fuel into an engine you haven't checked. Build the clarity first. Let the vision be so sharp that when the capital finally arrives, and it will, because clear visions attract resources, you already know precisely where every unit of it needs to go. Try this exercise before you write a single business plan or approach a single investor. Write your vision as a single paragraph, without any jargon, the way you would explain it to a relative who knows nothing about your industry. If you find yourself reaching for vague phrases like disrupting the space or creating synergy, stop and rewrite it in plain language. If your grandmother couldn't understand what you're building and why it matters after reading that paragraph, your vision isn't clear yet. It's just dressed up to sound impressive. Impressive language often hides a lack of real clarity underneath it. Plain language exposes whether the clarity is actually there. It also helps to write down what you would do with the very first, smallest amount of money available to you, not the dream budget, but a fraction of it. If you can't answer that clearly, specifically, and confidently, that's a signal your vision still needs sharpening before capital enters the picture at all. A founder who knows exactly how they'd use 100,000 naira wisely is far more trustworthy with 100 million than a founder who can only speak in grand totals and general ambitions. Revisit your vision statement regularly, not to change it on a whim, but to test it against what you're actually learning as you move forward. A vision is not a stone tablet handed down once and never touched again. It's a working document that should sharpen with every conversation you have with real customers, every piece of feedback, every small test you run. The founders who struggle most are often the ones who wrote a vision once, early on, and then either abandoned it entirely at the first sign of difficulty or refused to adjust it even as clear evidence suggested a better path. Hold your vision with conviction, and hold your specific assumptions about it loosely enough to be corrected by reality. Chapter 3. The Entrepreneur's Eye, Spotting Opportunity Where Others See Noise. Two people can walk down the same street, see the same shops, hear the same complaints from the same customers, and walk away with entirely different conclusions. One sees ordinary frustration, a long queue, a bad product, a service that never quite works right, and moves on without a second thought. The other sees the same scene and asks a different question: why hasn't anyone fixed this yet? That second question is the seed of every opportunity that has ever been built into a business. This is what I call the entrepreneur's eye, and it is a trained skill, not a gift some people are born with and others aren't. Most people move through the world filtering out friction because friction is uncomfortable to notice. The entrepreneur trains themselves to do the opposite, to lean into friction, to sit with it, to ask why it persists when it seems so obviously fixable. Complaints that everyone else treats as background noise are, to the trained eye, a map of unmet needs. Opportunity rarely announces itself with a neon sign. It usually shows up disguised as a complaint, a workaround, an inefficiency people have simply learned to tolerate. Someone says, "I hate that I have to do this the hard way, but that's just how it is." That sentence, "that's just how it is," is one of the most valuable sentences an entrepreneur can hear, because it signals a problem nobody has bothered to challenge. Every industry is full of things people have quietly accepted simply because no one has offered them a better option yet. Training this eye starts with a simple habit: pay attention to your own frustrations first. What do you personally find yourself working around, apologizing for, or tolerating because you assume there's no better way? Your own daily friction is data. Then widen the lens, listen to how the people around you complain. Not with sympathy alone, but with curiosity. What would it take to remove that specific friction for them? Could it be removed at a price they'd be willing to pay? Opportunity spotting also requires you to separate a real problem from a personal preference. Not every irritation is a business. Some complaints are simply the cost of living in a complex world, and trying to solve them would cost more than anyone would ever pay to fix them. The skill is not just noticing friction, it's evaluating whether the friction is big enough, common enough, and painful enough that people would actually exchange money to make it go away. This filtering step is where a lot of excitement dies quietly, and that's a good thing. Better to kill a weak idea in a notebook than after 18 months of your life. There is also a deeper layer to this eye, the ability to see around corners, to notice shifts before they become obvious to everyone else. Prices moving. Habits changing. A generation growing up with different expectations than the one before it. Entrepreneurs who build ahead of the curve are usually the ones who paid attention to small signals long before those signals became headlines. By the time an opportunity is obvious to everyone, the margin has already shrunk, because everyone else saw it too. You build this skill the same way you build any other: repetition. Walk through your world today asking, what is broken here that people have simply gotten used to? Ask it at the market, at your workplace, in your own frustrations with your phone, your bank, your commute. Write down every answer, even the ones that seem too small to matter. Most will lead nowhere. A few will lead everywhere. You won't know which is which until you've trained yourself to notice them all. The entrepreneur's eye is not about being cleverer than everyone else. It's about being more willing than everyone else to sit in discomfort long enough to ask why the discomfort exists, and whether it has to. Most people move past friction because stopping to examine it is inconvenient. The entrepreneur stops on purpose. That single habit, stopping where others walk past, is where opportunity has always lived, quietly, waiting for someone to notice it. Start a simple habit this week: carry a notebook, physical or digital, dedicated entirely to friction you notice. Every time you catch yourself thinking, "This is so annoying," or hear someone else say the same, write it down with as much specific detail as you can capture in the moment: who was affected, what exactly went wrong, and what a better version might look like. Don't judge the entries as you write them. Some will be silly, some will be too small to ever become a business, and a few, over time, will start repeating across different situations and different people. Those repeats are worth paying close attention to, because a friction point that shows up again and again across unrelated contexts is rarely a coincidence. Once you have a growing list, practice the filtering step deliberately rather than getting swept up by excitement. For each entry, ask 3 questions honestly: how many people actually experience this regularly, how much pain does it genuinely cause them, and would they realistically pay to make it disappear? An idea that fails even one of these 3 tests usually isn't worth building a business around, no matter how clever the solution feels. The goal of this exercise isn't to find one perfect idea overnight. It's to train the eye itself, so that noticing real opportunity eventually becomes automatic instead of accidental. Remember, too, that opportunity spotted is not the same as opportunity captured. Plenty of people notice the same gap you do. The real advantage belongs to whoever moves from noticing to testing the fastest, with the least wasted motion. Don't fall into the trap of endlessly collecting ideas without ever validating one. The entrepreneur's eye is only half the skill. The other half is the discipline to act on what it finds before the observation grows cold in a notebook nobody ever opens again. Give yourself a firm deadline to act on your strongest entries: a small conversation, a rough prototype, a single test offer, within a set number of days of writing them down. Ideas lose their urgency quickly once life's other demands crowd back in, and the notebook that once felt exciting can just as easily become a graveyard of good intentions if nothing ever moves from observation into action. Chapter 4. Risk is a skill, not a gamble. People love to describe entrepreneurs as risk-takers, as if courage alone were the secret ingredient. It isn't. The entrepreneurs who last are not the ones who take the biggest risks, they are the ones who have learned to evaluate risk with a precision that looks like fearlessness from the outside but is actually discipline on the inside. Risk, done well, is not a gamble. It is a calculation. And calculation is a skill you can build. The gambler and the entrepreneur can look identical in the moment of decision, both are putting something on the line without a guaranteed outcome. But the gambler is relying on chance, while the entrepreneur is relying on information, preparation, and a clear-eyed understanding of what happens if the bet doesn't pay off. The difference isn't in the boldness of the action. It's in everything that happened before the action, the research, the small tests, the worst-case planning that made the leap survivable even if it failed. One of the most important skills you can develop is the ability to separate risks that are reversible from risks that are not. Reversible risks, trying a new product line, testing a new marketing angle, hiring someone on a trial basis, deserve boldness, because even if they fail, you can undo the damage and keep moving. Irreversible risks, the kind that could sink your entire business, your reputation, or your family's financial stability, deserve extreme caution, slow deliberation, and often a flat refusal unless the odds are overwhelmingly in your favor. Confusing the two is how promising entrepreneurs destroy everything they built. Ask yourself, before any major decision, if this goes wrong, can I recover? Not, will it be painful, pain is a given in this path, but can I actually rebuild from the position I'd be left in? If the honest answer is no, you are not being brave by proceeding. You are being reckless, and the two are often mistaken for each other until the bill comes due. Risk management also means building in margin before you need it. This is the boring, unglamorous side of the skill, keeping enough reserve that a single bad month doesn't end everything, diversifying so that one client or one product line isn't holding your entire operation hostage, testing assumptions on a small scale before committing large amounts of capital or time. None of this makes for an exciting story later, but it is precisely what allows there to be a later at all. There's a particular trap worth naming here, the sunk cost trap. Once you've invested time, money, and identity into a decision, it becomes painfully difficult to admit it isn't working and change course. People will keep throwing good resources after bad simply because walking away feels like admitting failure. But a skilled risk-taker treats every ongoing decision as a fresh question, not, how much have I already spent, but, given everything I know right now, is this still the best use of my next dollar and my next hour? If the answer is no, the earlier investment is already gone regardless of what you choose next. Don't let a decision that's already made hold hostage the decisions still in front of you. Fear, in this context, is not your enemy. Fear is data. When your gut tightens at a decision, the useful move is not to override it blindly in the name of boldness, nor to obey it blindly in the name of safety, it's to interrogate it. Is this fear pointing at a real, specific danger I haven't accounted for, or is it just the generic discomfort of doing something new? The first kind of fear deserves your full attention. The second kind is simply the toll you pay for growth, and paying it is part of the job. Over time, the entrepreneurs who build lasting success develop something close to a sixth sense for risk, not because they're gifted, but because they've made enough calculated bets, tracked enough outcomes, and reviewed enough of their own decisions honestly to know what a good bet actually feels like before it happens. That sense is earned through repetition and honest review, not talent. Build it deliberately, write down your reasoning before every significant decision, and revisit it afterward regardless of the outcome. That habit alone will teach you more about risk than any amount of motivational talk about courage. A useful practice is to run every major decision through a simple written framework before you act. What is the best realistic outcome? What is the worst realistic outcome? and what is the most likely outcome given everything you currently know. Most people only imagine the best case when they're excited about an opportunity, and only imagine the worst case when fear has already taken hold. Writing out all three, calmly, before you're emotionally invested one way or the other, gives you a far more honest picture than relying on whatever mood happens to be dominating your thinking that day. It also helps to define your worst-case tolerance in advance, before you're standing in the middle of a decision under pressure. Decide, ahead of time and in a calm moment, the maximum amount of money, time, or reputation you are willing to risk on any single bet at your current stage. When an opportunity comes along that exceeds that limit, you don't need to relitigate the decision in the heat of the moment. You already know the answer, because you set the boundary before emotion had the chance to move it. Finally, resist the romantic idea that great entrepreneurs feel no fear before a big decision. They feel it just as sharply as anyone else. The difference is they've built a process sturdy enough to make good decisions in spite of that fear, rather than waiting for the fear to disappear before acting. Courage in business is rarely the absence of nervousness. It's the presence of a clear-eyed calculation that lets you move forward even while your stomach is still uneasy about it. Treat every decision, win or lose, as another rep in building this skill. The entrepreneur who has made 100 calculated bets, tracked, reviewed, and refined, will read new risks with a sharpness that no shortcut can replicate. That sharpness is what people eventually call instinct, even though it was never anything more mysterious than practice, honestly reviewed. Chapter 5. Building systems, not just selling products. A product can make you money. A system can make you free. This is one of the most important distinctions in business, and it's one that far too many entrepreneurs never learn, because in the early days, hustle disguises the problem. You can grind your way through the first year on sheer will, answering every message yourself, fulfilling every order yourself, making every decision yourself, and it will feel like progress because revenue is coming in. But hustle without systems is a ceiling in disguise. It works right up until it doesn't, and then it collapses all at once, usually at the worst possible time. A system, in the simplest terms, is a repeatable process that produces a consistent result without requiring your constant, personal involvement. It's the difference between you personally making sure every customer gets a response, and a documented process that ensures every customer gets a response whether you're in the building or not. Systems are what allow a business to outlive the founder's daily presence. Without them, you haven't built a business, you've built yourself a very demanding job. Most entrepreneurs resist building systems for an understandable reason: it feels slower than just doing the thing yourself. In the short term, that's true. Documenting a process, training someone else to run it, building checks to make sure it's done right, all of that takes longer than simply doing the task with your own hands one more time. But this is the trap of short-term thinking. Every hour you spend building a system is an hour that pays you back hundreds of times over, because it removes you as the bottleneck permanently, while every hour you spend just doing the task yourself pays you back exactly once. Start by identifying the tasks in your business that repeat. Anything you find yourself doing more than a handful of times is a candidate for a system. Ask, could I write down exactly how I do this, step by step, clearly enough that someone with no prior knowledge could follow it and get roughly the same result I would get? If the answer is no, that's not a reason to skip building the system, it's a sign you don't yet fully understand your own process, which is worth fixing regardless. Systems aren't only about delegation to other people. They're also about protecting quality and consistency at scale. A customer's first experience with your business should not depend on which employee happened to be on shift that day, or whether you personally were paying close attention. It should depend on a process that has been designed carefully enough to produce the same quality experience regardless of who's executing it. This is what separates businesses that scale gracefully from businesses that fall apart the moment they grow past what one person can personally oversee. Think about the parts of your business where quality currently depends entirely on your mood, your memory, or your personal attention that day. Those are the danger zones. A business that only works when the founder is at their best, fully rested, and paying close attention is a fragile business, no matter how much revenue it currently produces. The goal of a system is to make the outcome depend on the process, not on the person running it that day, including you. This doesn't mean removing yourself from everything. Some parts of your business should remain deeply personal: the vision, the culture, the relationships that matter most. The point of systems is not to make you irrelevant. It's to make you selective, so that your time and energy go toward the handful of things that genuinely require your judgment, while everything else runs reliably without demanding it. Building systems is slower, less glamorous, and far less exciting than closing another sale. But it is the difference between an entrepreneur who is trapped inside their own success and one who is free to keep building, expanding, and eventually stepping back without everything collapsing behind them. Sell the product today. Build the system for tomorrow. One pays your bills. The other builds your freedom. A practical place to begin is what some call the hit by a bus test, not a comfortable phrase, but an honest one. If you disappeared from your business for 2 weeks with no warning and no ability to be reached, what would happen? Which parts would keep running smoothly, and which parts would grind to a halt because they exist only in your head or depend entirely on your personal hands? Whatever fails that test first is exactly where your next system needs to be built. Don't try to systemize everything at once, that's overwhelming and rarely sticks. Pick the single most fragile point, the one that would cause the most damage if it broke while you were away, and fix that one first. Documentation doesn't need to be elaborate to be effective. A simple checklist, a short recorded video walking through a process on your phone, or a one-page written procedure is often enough to remove you as the single point of failure. The goal isn't a polished manual, it's a resource clear enough that someone else could pick it up and produce a similar result without needing to call you every step of the way. Start rough, improve it as you use it, and resist the perfectionism that keeps so many systems permanently stuck in someone's head instead of written down where the business can actually rely on them. As your systems mature, review them periodically rather than treating them as finished once written. A process that worked well when you had 5 customers may quietly break down at 50, not because anyone did anything wrong, but because the business around it has changed shape. Build a habit of asking, every few months, whether each core system still fits the size and complexity of what you're currently running, and update it before it breaks, not after. The businesses that scale gracefully are rarely the ones with the most talented founder. They are the ones where the founder's best thinking got captured into a process early enough that it could be taught, repeated, and improved by others long after that first burst of personal effort had run its course. Chapter 6. The CEO Voice: How to Speak, Decide, and Command Respect. There is a specific way a CEO speaks that has nothing to do with volume, and everything to do with certainty earned through preparation. You felt it before, even if you couldn't name it, the difference between someone who fills a room with noise and someone who fills a room with weight. The first person talks a lot. The second person says exactly what needs to be said, and somehow everyone listens harder for it. Developing what I call the CEO voice starts with a hard truth: most people talk to avoid silence, not to communicate something they've actually thought through. They fill space out of discomfort. A CEO learns to be comfortable with silence, comfortable with pausing before answering, comfortable saying, "Let me think about that and get back to you," instead of manufacturing an answer on the spot just to seem decisive. Real decisiveness isn't about speed. It's about clarity, even if clarity takes an extra moment to arrive. Command doesn't come from volume or aggression. It comes from consistency between what you say and what you do. People respect leaders whose word means something, whose commitments are reliable enough that others can plan around them without needing to double-check. If you say a decision will be made by Friday, it's made by Friday. If you say you'll follow up, you follow up. This sounds small, almost too obvious to mention, but it is one of the rarest and most powerful habits a leader can build, because most people's word slowly erodes under the pressure of daily life. Protect yours deliberately. Decision-making is where the CEO voice is tested most directly. Indecision, dragged out too long, is its own kind of decision. it tells everyone around you that you either don't trust your own judgment or don't respect their time enough to give them a clear answer. This doesn't mean rushing every decision recklessly. It means developing a clear internal process, gather the information you actually need, set a deadline for yourself to decide, and then decide, even when the information isn't perfect, because it almost never will be. Waiting for certainty before deciding anything is how good opportunities quietly expire while you're still gathering data. Learn to separate reversible decisions from irreversible ones, as covered earlier, and let that distinction set your pace. Most day-to-day decisions are reversible. Make them quickly, adjust if needed, and move on. Save your slow, careful deliberation for the decisions that genuinely deserve it. A leader who treats every decision with the same heavy weight becomes exhausting to work with and, eventually, paralyzed by the sheer volume of choices in front of them. Respect is also built in how you handle being wrong. This is where many people who have built some authority lose it. They become defensive the moment their judgment is questioned, protecting their ego instead of protecting the truth. A CEO who can say plainly, "I was wrong about that, here's what we're doing differently," earns more long-term respect than one who never admits error, because everyone around them already knows when a mistake has been made. Pretending otherwise doesn't protect your authority. It quietly erodes it. Tone matters as much as content. There is a version of firmness that respects the people you're speaking to, and a version that simply dominates them. The first builds loyalty that lasts. The second builds compliance that evaporates the moment you're not watching. Speak plainly, speak honestly, and speak in a way that treats the people around you as capable adults who can handle direct truth, because most people can handle far more honesty than we typically give them credit for, and they respect the person who trusts them with it. The CEO voice, ultimately, is not a performance. It is the natural outward expression of someone who has done the internal work, who has clarity about their vision, discipline in their decisions, and integrity between their words and their actions. You cannot fake this convincingly for long. But you can build it, deliberately, the same way you build any other skill in this book, through repetition, through self-correction, and through the daily choice to speak only what you're willing to stand behind. Practice this in low-stakes moments before you need it in high-stakes ones. The next time someone asks your opinion in a meeting or a conversation, resist the urge to answer instantly with whatever comes to mind first. Take a breath, form the thought fully, and then speak it once, clearly, without immediately qualifying it into mush with, "but I could be wrong," or "just my opinion though." You can be open to being wrong without undercutting your own statement before anyone has even had the chance to respond to it. Notice how differently people react to a clear, complete sentence compared to a hedged, half-finished one. Pay attention as well to how often you say yes to things you haven't actually thought through, simply to avoid the discomfort of an honest, "let me think about it." A CEO's voice is not just about what gets said, it's equally about what doesn't get said carelessly. Protect your yes and your no as commitments that mean something, and you'll find that people begin listening more closely to both, because they've learned your words carry weight rather than filler. The CEO voice is ultimately a form of respect, for yourself, for your time, and for the people relying on your judgment. It says, quietly and consistently, that you have thought carefully about what you're saying before you said it, and that you're prepared to stand behind it. That kind of respect cannot be manufactured with confident-sounding language alone. It is earned through the private discipline of thinking clearly before you ever open your mouth to speak. Keep practicing it in ordinary conversations, not just important ones, because the voice you use under low pressure is the voice that will show up automatically under high pressure. You don't rise to the occasion in a crisis. You fall back to the level of the habits you've already built long before the crisis arrived. Chapter 7. Delegation is leverage. Stop doing everything yourself. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from believing you are the only one capable of doing things right. It masquerades as high standards, as dedication, as being a hard worker who simply cares more than everyone else. But underneath it is usually something less flattering, a discomfort with letting go, a fear that if you're not personally controlling every detail, the whole thing might fall apart. That fear feels protective. In reality, it's the single biggest ceiling most growing entrepreneurs build for themselves without realizing it. Delegation is not about laziness or stepping back from responsibility. It is leverage, the ability to multiply your output by putting your time behind the decisions only you can make, while trusting capable people to execute the decisions that don't require your personal hand. Every hour you spend doing something someone else could be trained to do is an hour stolen from the work that actually requires your specific judgment, vision, or relationships. That trade is far more costly than it feels in the moment. The resistance to delegating usually comes from one of a few honest fears: that no one will do it as well as you would, that training someone takes longer than just doing it yourself, or that letting go of control means losing the ability to guarantee quality. Every one of these fears has some truth in it in the short term. In the long term, every one of them is a trap, because a business that depends entirely on your personal execution cannot grow past what your two hands can physically accomplish in a day. Start delegating with the tasks that are highest in volume and lowest in judgment required. These are the easiest to hand off cleanly, because the risk of a mistake is low and the time saved is high. As trust builds, both your trust in the person, and their confidence in the role, gradually hand off tasks that require more judgment. This is not a one-time event. It's a continuous process of raising the ceiling of what you're comfortable letting go of, as the people around you prove themselves capable of holding it. One of the most underrated skills in delegation is teaching, not just assigning. Handing someone a task without context, without explaining the why behind it, sets them up to fail and confirms your fear that no one does it as well as I would. Of course they don't, you never gave them the understanding that would let them. Take the time to explain not just what needs to be done, but why it matters, what a good outcome looks like, and what mistakes to watch for. That upfront investment is what turns a task doer into someone you can genuinely trust with judgment calls later. You also have to accept a hard truth: someone else's way of doing a task well might not look exactly like your way. This is where a lot of delegation quietly fails. The delegator keeps pulling the task back because the output doesn't match their personal method, even when the result is genuinely good. Learn to evaluate outcomes, not methods. If the result meets the standard, the path someone took to get there doesn't need to mirror yours exactly. Holding people to your process instead of your standard is a fast way to make them stop trying to improve on their own. Delegation also requires you to build feedback loops instead of control loops. A control loop means you personally check and approve everything before it goes out, which scales terribly and communicates, quietly, that you don't trust the person. A feedback loop means you check in at reasonable intervals, correct course when needed, and let people build confidence through repetition. The goal is not zero oversight, it's oversight that shrinks over time as competence and trust grow, rather than oversight that stays permanently tight because you never let it evolve. Every entrepreneur who has built something that outlasts their own two hands learned this lesson, usually the hard way, through burnout, through a season where they tried to be everywhere at once and discovered they couldn't be. You can learn it the easier way, by choosing today to hand off one thing you've been holding onto too tightly. Not because you don't care about the outcome, but because you care about it enough to want it to survive without you carrying every piece of it alone. To start, make a simple list of every task that currently passes through your hands in a typical week. Next to each one, mark whether it truly requires your specific judgment, or whether it's simply something you've always done out of habit rather than necessity. You'll likely find that a large portion of your time is spent on tasks that could be handed off with the right training, while only a small fraction genuinely needs your unique judgment, relationships, or vision. That small fraction is where your time belongs. Everything else is a candidate for delegation, even if letting go of it feels uncomfortable at first. When you do hand something off, resist the temptation to take it back at the first sign of imperfection. Early mistakes during delegation are not proof that delegation doesn't work, they're simply the cost of training, the same cost you paid yourself when you were first learning that task. Give clear feedback, allow room for a second and third attempt, and measure progress over weeks, not single instances. The short-term dip in quality that often comes with a new person learning a role is temporary. The long-term freedom you gain by no longer being the bottleneck is permanent. Understand, too, that delegation is a relationship, not a transaction. The people you hand responsibility to are far more likely to rise to meet it when they feel genuinely trusted and valued, not simply used as an extension of your own hands. Invest in the people you're delegating to, their growth, their understanding of the bigger picture, their sense of ownership over their piece of the work, and you'll find they carry that responsibility with a level of care that no amount of instruction alone could have produced. Chapter 8. Money moves like water: cash flow, discipline, and growth. Profit is a number on paper. Cash is what pays your staff on Friday. This is one of the most painful lessons in business, and one that has quietly ended companies that looked successful on every report except the one that mattered: their bank balance on the day payment was due. Understanding the difference between profitability and liquidity is not optional knowledge for an entrepreneur. It is survival knowledge. Money moves like water, it flows in and out constantly, and if you're not watching the timing of that movement closely, you can be profitable on paper and still run dry in reality. A business can have strong sales, healthy margins, and an impressive year-end statement, and still collapse because the cash from a big sale arrived 30 days after the rent, the salaries, and the suppliers were due. This is not a hypothetical. It is one of the most common, most preventable reasons promising businesses fail. The discipline here starts with tracking cash flow, not just revenue. Know exactly what's coming in, when it's actually landing in your account, not when the invoice was sent, but when the payment clears, and know exactly what's going out and when it's due. This sounds tedious, and it is. But the entrepreneurs who survive long enough to build something lasting are almost always the ones who treated this tedious tracking as non-negotiable, while the ones who treated it as an afterthought learned the hard way why it mattered. Build a buffer before you need one. This is uncomfortable advice because it asks you to hold back money you could otherwise reinvest into growth, marketing, or expansion. But a reserve, even a modest one, is what allows your business to absorb a slow month, a late-paying client, or an unexpected expense without a full-blown crisis. Businesses without any buffer are one bad month away from a decision they'll regret. Build the buffer while things are going well, because you will not have the luxury of building it calmly once things go wrong. Growth itself has to be funded carefully. There is a specific and common trap called overtrading, growing revenue faster than your cash flow can actually support. It sounds like a good problem to have, but it can sink a business just as fast as a slow sales month. Every new client, every new order, every expansion often requires spending money up front, on inventory, on staff, on materials, before the resulting revenue actually arrives. If you scale that spending faster than your cash cycle can support it, you can be growing your sales and starving your bank account at the exact same time. Growth needs to be paced against your actual cash position, not just against your ambition. Separate personal spending from business spending completely, and treat that separation as sacred, not situational. This is one of the simplest pieces of financial discipline and also one of the most commonly ignored, especially in the early days when the business and the founder's life feel intertwined. Blurred lines between personal and business money make it nearly impossible to actually know how your business is performing, and they create tax and compliance risks that can cost you far more later than the convenience saved you now. Debt is a tool, not a rescue plan. Used deliberately, to fund a clear, tested growth opportunity with a realistic repayment plan, debt can accelerate a healthy business. Used to cover ongoing losses or to paper over a business model that isn't actually working, debt simply delays the reckoning while making it more expensive when it finally arrives. Before taking on any debt, ask honestly, is this funding growth I've already proven works, or is it funding hope that something will eventually work? Those are very different bets, and they deserve very different levels of caution. Financial discipline is not glamorous. It doesn't make for an exciting story, and it's rarely the part of entrepreneurship anyone dreams about when they first imagine building something of their own. But it is the quiet foundation underneath every business that survives long enough to become something significant. Master your cash flow before you chase your next big move. Water finds every crack in a foundation that isn't solid, make sure yours is. A simple habit worth building immediately is a weekly cash review, a fixed time, the same day every week, where you sit down and look honestly at what came in, what went out, and what's due in the coming weeks. This doesn't require complicated software or an accounting degree. A basic spreadsheet, updated consistently, will tell you more about the true health of your business than an impressive-looking profit figure calculated once a year. The businesses that get caught off guard by a cash crisis are almost always the ones that only looked closely at their numbers occasionally, when it was already too late to adjust course. When you're deciding whether to reinvest profit back into growth or hold it as a reserve, resist the pressure to always choose growth simply because growth feels more exciting. Ask honestly what would happen to your business in its current state if your slowest month became twice as slow and lasted twice as long as expected. If that scenario would put you in real danger, your reserve needs attention before your next expansion does. Growth built on top of a fragile cash position is not real progress, it's simply a bigger, faster way to eventually run into the same crisis, only with more people and more obligations depending on you when it happens. Ultimately, financial discipline is an act of respect toward everyone who depends on your business, your staff who need their salaries paid on time, your suppliers who trusted you with credit, and your own family who counts on the stability of what you've built. Treat that responsibility with the seriousness it deserves, long before a crisis forces you to. The entrepreneurs who last are rarely the ones who made the most money in a single good year. They are the ones who protected their cash position carefully enough to still be standing after several ordinary ones. Chapter 9. Failure is tuition, turning losses into strategy. Every entrepreneur worth studying has a failure story, and most of them will tell you it taught them more than any success ever did. This is not a comforting cliché meant to soften the sting of loss. It's a practical truth about how learning actually works. Success tells you that something worked, but it rarely tells you exactly why, or which specific decision mattered most. Failure, examined honestly, is far more precise. It shows you exactly where the plan broke, and that precision is worth more than any amount of praise. The problem is not failure itself. The problem is what most people do after failure. They either collapse into shame and quit, or they rush to explain it away without ever extracting the lesson buried inside it. Both responses waste the one valuable thing a failure actually offers, information you paid for, often at great cost, that you now have the chance to actually use. Think of failure as tuition. You paid for an education, whether or not you meant to enroll in it. The only real question is whether you're going to walk away from that expensive lesson with nothing but the bill, or whether you're going to extract every bit of value the loss is willing to give you. The entrepreneurs who build lasting success are rarely the ones who failed less than everyone else. They are usually the ones who failed and then refused to let that failure go to waste. This requires a specific discipline, the honest post-mortem. After something goes wrong, resist both the urge to blame everyone but yourself and the urge to drown in self-blame that paralyzes you from moving forward. Instead, sit down and ask precise questions. What decision, specifically, led to this outcome? What information did I have at the time, and what information did I ignore or fail to gather? What would I do differently with what I know now? Write the answers down. Memory is unreliable and tends to soften our own role in outcomes over time. A written record keeps you honest with yourself later. There's a difference between a failure of execution and a failure of the underlying idea, and confusing the two costs entrepreneurs dearly. Sometimes the concept was sound but the execution was flawed, wrong timing, wrong team, wrong pricing, wrong marketing. That kind of failure often means the idea deserves another attempt, executed better. Other times, the idea itself was the problem. The market genuinely didn't want what you were offering, no matter how well you executed it. That kind of failure means it's time to let the idea go, not to keep refining the execution of something the market has already rejected. Learning to tell these two apart is one of the most valuable analytical skills you can develop. Resilience is often described as simply refusing to quit, but that's an incomplete picture. Blind persistence in a direction that clearly isn't working is not resilience, it's stubbornness dressed up as courage. Real resilience is the willingness to keep showing up to the larger mission while being flexible enough to abandon a specific approach that has proven itself wrong. You are not married to any single method. You are committed to the outcome, and committed methods should be replaced the moment the evidence says they're not working. There's also a social cost to failure that entrepreneurs have to learn to manage, the discomfort of being seen to fail, especially in communities where success is publicly celebrated and struggle is quietly hidden. Resist the urge to perform confidence you don't feel just to protect your image. The entrepreneurs who build real, lasting reputations are the ones who are honest about their setbacks and visibly learn from them, not the ones who pretend every month was a win. People trust a builder who is honest about the road far more than one who only ever shows the highlight reel. Every loss you experience in business is a transaction. You paid a price, money, time, reputation, energy, and in exchange, you received information that most people never bother to properly examine before moving on. Don't let that transaction go to waste. Extract the lesson deliberately, apply it precisely, and let every failure become a brick in the foundation of the judgment that eventually makes you very difficult to defeat. Build a simple habit around this. Every time something in your business fails to go as planned, no matter how small, write a short account of it within 24 hours, while the details are still fresh and before your memory has had time to reshape the story in your favor. Note what you expected to happen, what actually happened, and the specific decision point where the two diverged. Over months and years, this becomes a personal archive of hard-won judgment that no course, mentor, or book can fully replace, because it's built from your exact circumstances, your exact market, and your exact mistakes. It's also worth revisiting old failures periodically, not to relive the discomfort, but to check whether you actually applied the lesson or simply understood it intellectually without changing your behavior. Understanding a mistake and correcting the pattern that caused it are two very different things, and it's entirely possible to write a thoughtful lesson down and still repeat the same error months later because the underlying habit was never actually retrained. Revisit, verify, and adjust. That's what turns tuition into a return on investment instead of just an expensive story you tell at dinner. There is a strange kind of freedom that comes from no longer fearing failure the way you once did, not because you've stopped caring about outcomes, but because you've learned that even the worst outcomes leave something valuable behind if you're willing to look for it honestly. That freedom lets you take the calculated risks in earlier chapters with far less hesitation, because you know that even a loss will still move you forward, as long as you refuse to waste the lesson it came to deliver. Chapter 10. Building a brand people trust. A brand is not a logo, a color scheme, or a clever slogan. Those are the surface, the parts you can see. A brand, underneath all of that, is a promise that has been kept consistently enough that people stop needing to think about whether you'll deliver. That is the entire foundation of trust, and trust is the single most valuable, most fragile asset any entrepreneur builds over time. People do business with entities they trust, even when a cheaper or flashier option exists elsewhere. This is why brand building is not a marketing luxury reserved for companies with large budgets, it is a survival strategy available to anyone willing to be consistent. You don't need a big budget to build trust. You need reliability, repeated often enough and long enough that people begin to expect it from you automatically. The foundation of a trustworthy brand is simple to state and difficult to practice. Do what you said you would do, every single time, especially when it's inconvenient. Trust is not built in the easy moments, when keeping your word costs you nothing. It's built in the moments when keeping your word is expensive, when it would be easier to cut a corner, miss a deadline, or quietly lower a standard because no one would immediately notice. Those are the moments that actually determine whether your brand becomes something people rely on or something people quietly stop expecting much from. Consistency also applies to how you communicate, not just what you deliver. A brand voice that shifts wildly, professional one day, careless the next, warm in one interaction and cold in another, creates a subtle unease in the people encountering it, even if they can't articulate exactly why. People trust what feels predictable. Decide, deliberately, how your brand sounds and behaves, and hold that line consistently, even as your business grows and more people are speaking on its behalf. Transparency is another underrated pillar of trust, particularly when something goes wrong. Every brand, no matter how well run, will eventually disappoint a customer or make a mistake. The brands that survive that moment with their trust intact are the ones that own the mistake honestly and fix it visibly, rather than the ones that hide, deflect, or minimize what happened. People forgive mistakes far more readily than they forgive being treated like they're not owed the truth. A trustworthy brand also has to be built on something deeper than transactions. It needs a clear point of view about what it stands for and, just as importantly, what it refuses to compromise on. This is what separates a business people merely use from a brand people actively choose, recommend, and defend. Know what your business stands for beyond making money, and let that show up consistently in how you operate, not just in what you say in your marketing. Reputation compounds, for better or worse. Every interaction, every kept promise, every honestly handled mistake adds a small deposit into a reservoir of trust that takes years to build and can be drained shockingly fast by a single serious breach of it. Protect that reservoir the way you'd protect any asset that took years to accumulate, with more caution than confidence, because trust is far easier to lose than to rebuild. Building a brand people trust is not about being the loudest, the cheapest, or the most visible. It's about being the most dependable, the entity people can bring their money, their time, and their expectations to, again and again, with a quiet confidence that you will deliver what you said you would. That reputation, built patiently over time, will eventually do more for your growth than any single advertisement ever could. Start by auditing your own consistency honestly. Look back over the last few months of how your business has interacted with customers, clients, or partners. Were there moments where a promise was quietly missed, a deadline slipped without explanation, or a standard dropped because things got busy? Those moments, however small they felt at the time, are exactly where trust erodes without you noticing. Identify them, and put a specific plan in place to prevent them from repeating, not a vague intention to do better, but an actual process change that removes the conditions that caused the slip in the first place. It's also worth deciding, in writing, what your brand will never do, regardless of how tempting a shortcut might be in a difficult month. This could be a refusal to misrepresent a product, a commitment to always communicate delays honestly rather than going silent, or a standard of quality you won't lower even under financial pressure. Having these lines defined clearly, before you're under pressure, makes them far easier to hold when a real test eventually comes, and it will come, for every brand that lasts long enough to be tested. Word of mouth remains, even now, the most powerful form of marketing any brand can earn, and it cannot be purchased directly, it has to be deserved. Every customer who leaves an interaction with your business slightly more impressed than they expected to be becomes an unpaid advocate, telling others without being asked to. Every customer who leaves disappointed becomes the opposite, often more vocal about the bad experience than a satisfied customer ever is about a good one. This asymmetry is exactly why consistency matters more than occasional brilliance. A brand that is reliably good every time builds more trust than one that is occasionally excellent and unpredictably poor. Building a brand people trust is, in the end, simply the outward expression of an entrepreneur who has decided to take their promises seriously. It requires no special talent, no large budget, and no clever marketing trick, only the discipline to keep showing up the same reliable way, especially in the moments when it would be easiest to let the standard slip and no one would immediately notice the difference. Over enough time, that discipline becomes indistinguishable from what people simply call a good name, and a good name, once earned, tends to open doors that no advertising budget ever could. Chapter 11. Scaling without losing yourself. Growth changes everything, including you, and very few entrepreneurs prepare themselves for that part of the journey. Most preparation goes into scaling the business, the systems, the hiring, the operations. Very little goes into scaling the person running it, and this is where a surprising number of otherwise successful entrepreneurs quietly lose themselves in the process of building something bigger than they originally imagined. As a business scales, the demands on your time, attention, and identity multiply faster than most people anticipate. The founder who once knew every customer by name now oversees people who've never met those customers personally. The leader who once made every decision personally now has to trust decisions made without them in the room. This shift is necessary for growth, but it can feel like a loss of control, and if you're not deliberate about it, it can also feel like a loss of purpose, like the thing you're building no longer feels like yours in the way it once did. The antidote is not to resist growth or cling to doing everything personally, as we've already covered in the chapter on delegation. The antidote is to get radically clear, early, about which parts of the business are truly you, the parts that reflect your values, your judgment, your voice, and which parts are simply operational and can be run well by capable people without your personal fingerprints on every detail. Protect the first category fiercely. Release the second category generously. Confusing the two is how founders either burn out trying to hold on to everything, or drift so far from their original vision that the business no longer feels connected to why they started it. Scaling also tests your values in ways the early days never did. When it was just you, your standards were easy to maintain because you personally executed everything. As you grow, you are no longer just making decisions, you are setting the standard that dozens or hundreds of decisions, made by other people, will be measured against. This is where culture becomes critical, not as a poster on a wall, but as the actual, lived set of principles that guide how people behave when you're not in the room. If you don't define that deliberately, it will define itself, often in ways you won't like discovering later. There's a particular danger in scaling that deserves honest attention, the temptation to change who you are in order to fit an image of what a successful entrepreneur is supposed to look like. As visibility grows, so does the pressure to perform a version of yourself that seems more impressive, more polished, more distant from where you started. Resist this. The authenticity that built trust with your earliest customers, employees, and partners is the same authenticity that will keep that trust intact as you grow. People can sense when a leader has started performing a role instead of being themselves, and it erodes connection faster than almost anything else. Scaling well also means protecting your own capacity, not just your company's. Founders often treat their own burnout as an acceptable cost of growth, pushing through exhaustion because the business demands it. But a depleted founder makes worse decisions, communicates less clearly, and models an unsustainable pace for everyone watching them. Protecting your own rest, health, and boundaries is not indulgent, it is a strategic requirement for a business that depends on your judgment continuing to be sound. Stay anchored to why you started. As a business grows, it's easy to get pulled entirely into the mechanics, the metrics, the meetings, the operational fires, and lose touch with the original mission that made the sacrifices feel worth it in the first place. Revisit that mission deliberately and often. Let it be the compass that decides which opportunities to chase and which to decline, even as the noise around you grows louder and the options multiply. Scaling without losing yourself is ultimately about growing the business while keeping your identity, your values, and your sense of purpose intact underneath all of it. The size of the company should never become the measure of who you are. It's simply the current shape of what you've built. Stay rooted in the person and the purpose underneath the growth, and the growth will strengthen you instead of scattering you. As your responsibilities multiply, build in a regular, non-negotiable check-in with yourself, weekly or monthly, whatever fits your rhythm, where you ask honestly whether the business still feels connected to the person you were when you started it. Notice if you've begun making decisions purely to impress people, protect an image, or chase a number, rather than decisions that align with your actual values and the mission that first pulled you into this work. Catching that drift early, while it's still a small correction, is far easier than trying to reverse it after years of decisions have already pulled you far from where you began. It's also worth deliberately keeping a few grounding relationships close as you scale, people who knew you before any of this success, who will tell you the truth plainly rather than what they think a successful person wants to hear. Growth tends to surround founders with people who have something to gain from agreeing with them. Protect a small circle who doesn't, and listen to them seriously, especially when what they're saying is uncomfortable to hear. Scaling, done well, should feel less like losing yourself in something bigger and more like discovering how much larger the original version of you was always capable of becoming. The business grows, the responsibilities grow, the complexity grows, but the core of who you are, the values that shaped your very first decision to build something, should remain the steady center that all of that growth revolves around, not something that gets diluted or replaced by it along the way. Measure your growth, occasionally, by that standard rather than only by revenue or headcount. A business that has expanded significantly while its founder has stayed honest, grounded, and true to their original purpose is a far rarer and more impressive achievement than size alone could ever indicate. Chapter 12. The Long Game, Legacy over Applause. Applause is loud and it fades fast. Legacy is quiet and it lasts. This is the final distinction every entrepreneur eventually has to make, usually much later than they should, the choice between chasing the immediate validation of a win people can see today, and building something patient enough to still matter long after the applause has died down and moved on to someone else's announcement. It is easy to build a business optimized for applause. Chase the metrics that impress people at a glance, chase the launches that generate excitement, chase the version of success that photographs well. None of that is inherently wrong, visibility and momentum matter, and there's nothing noble about pretending otherwise. But a business built entirely for applause tends to be shallow, because it optimizes for the appearance of success rather than the substance of it, and those two things are not always the same. Legacy asks a different, harder question: what will still be true about this business, this brand, this body of work, 10 years from now, when the current excitement has completely faded and only the actual substance remains? That question forces you to build differently. It forces you to care about the quality of what you're creating even when no one is currently watching closely enough to notice the difference between excellent and merely adequate. The long game requires a specific patience that applause chasing actively works against. Real, durable value, a trustworthy reputation, a well-trained team, a genuinely useful product, a body of work that holds up under scrutiny, is almost always built slower than the appearance of value. This creates a real temptation. The slower, harder path of building something true is less immediately rewarding than the faster path of building something that merely looks impressive. Choosing the long game means accepting that the reward will often arrive later, and quieter, than you'd like. This doesn't mean legacy-minded entrepreneurs ignore short-term results. Short-term results are what keep the business alive long enough to reach the long term at all. We covered that reality clearly in the chapter on cash flow. But short-term results should serve the long-term vision, not replace it. Every decision can be tested against a simple question: does this choice make the business stronger and more trustworthy over the next decade, or does it just make this quarter look good at the expense of what comes after it? Legacy is also built through the people you develop along the way, not just the products or profits you generate. An entrepreneur focused purely on applause tends to view people instrumentally, as means to a personal win. An entrepreneur focused on legacy understands that the people they trained, mentored, and gave real opportunity to are themselves part of what gets left behind, carrying forward standards, skills, and values long after any single project has ended. Some of the most lasting impact you will ever have is invisible to the public entirely. It lives in the people who learned how to think, decide, and build because they watched you do it with integrity. There will be moments, especially early on, when the noisy, applause-driven path looks far more appealing than the quiet, legacy-driven one. The applause path offers immediate proof that you matter. The legacy path asks you to trust that the proof will come, later, in a form that's harder to see in the moment but far more durable once it arrives. Choosing legacy over applause, again and again, especially when no one is watching to reward you for the choice, is what separates entrepreneurs who built something temporary from those who built something that outlasts them. This is the true measure of thinking like an entrepreneur and acting like a CEO, not the size of the win you can point to today, but the strength of what remains standing after you've moved on to whatever comes next. Build for that. Build patiently, honestly, and with a standard high enough that it holds up long after the applause for today's win has already been forgotten. A useful practice as you close this book is to write a short letter to yourself, dated for 10 years from now, describing exactly what you want to still be true about your work, your reputation, and the people you've built alongside by that point. Not the size of your bank account, though that matters too, but the substance underneath it, the trust you've earned, the people you've developed, the standard you refuse to lower even when it would have been easier to. Keep that letter somewhere you'll actually see it again, and let it quietly guide the decisions in front of you now, especially the ones where the short-term temptation and the long-term legacy are pulling in different directions. Every chapter in this book has pointed toward the same underlying truth from a different angle. Thinking like an entrepreneur and acting like a CEO is not a single skill you acquire once. It is a daily practice of ownership, clarity, discipline, and integrity, repeated in ordinary moments until it becomes who you are rather than something you perform. You already have everything you need to begin. The only remaining question is whether you'll start today, in the room you're currently standing in, or wait for a permission that was never actually required. Close this book, but don't close the practice. Return to these chapters when a decision feels heavy, when a risk feels uncertain, when a failure feels final, or when applause is tempting you away from the slower, truer path. The mindset described here is not meant to be read once and admired. It is meant to be lived, tested, and returned to, again and again, until thinking like an entrepreneur and acting like a CEO is no longer something you're working toward, it's simply who you are. That is the true finish line of this entire book, not a certificate, not a title, but a quiet, internal transformation that shows up in how you handle every ordinary decision from here forward.